Welcome, weary traveler, to this cozy little corner of history. Tonight, as the stars twinkle outside your window and the world grows quiet, we'll take a gentle journey through time, across frozen rivers, vast forests, golden palaces, and snowy battlefields, to uncover the incredible story of the Russian Empire. We'll begin long ago, in the time of ancient Slavic tribes and wandering Norse adventurers. We'll meet princes and tsars, some wise, others fierce, and see how a small collection of settlements grew into one of the largest empires the world has ever known. Along the way, we'll hear about mighty rulers like Ivan the Terrible and Catherine the Great, brave reformers, tragic revolutions, and the people, peasants, soldiers, and thinkers who lived beneath it all. So pull your blanket close, take a deep breath, and let your imagination carry you far away, to the land where east meets west, and the past still whispers through the trees. Are you ready? Let's begin. In the shadowy mists of early European history, before there was any notion of a Russian Empire or even a unified Slavic identity, the eastern plains of Europe were home to scattered communities of tribal peoples. These Proto-Slavic groups, linguistically and culturally distinct from their western and southern counterparts, inhabited the forest-steppe regions between the Carpathians and the Volga River. For centuries, they maintained agrarian lifestyles, building wooden villages near rivers, engaging in rudimentary trade, and living in loosely organized clan systems. Their cultural practices emphasized communal life and pagan worship tied closely to nature and seasonal cycles, with deities governing the forests, rivers, sun, and thunder. As the early medieval period progressed, this patchwork of Slavic tribes began to encounter foreign peoples with increasingly complex political systems. Among the most influential of these were the Varangians, seafaring Norsemen from Scandinavia, who ventured deep into the continent via the extensive river networks of Eastern Europe. Known to the Slavs and Finnic peoples as Rus, these Norse adventurers were both traders and warriors. In the late 9th century, they carved a path of influence through the region, not only trading goods like furs, honey, and slaves with Byzantium and the Islamic world, but also imposing themselves as rulers over Slavic settlements. The fusion of Slavic and Norse elements would be the bedrock upon which one of Europe's most formidable empires would eventually rise. The year 862 CE traditionally marks the beginning of Russian statehood, with the legendary invitation extended to the Varangian leader Rurik to rule over Novgorod. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reflects a period of consolidation and increasing political centralization. Rurik's successors expanded southward, eventually establishing the city of Kiev as a central hub of power. By the turn of the 10th century, this burgeoning realm, later known as Kievan Rus, had transformed from a network of trading posts into a loose but increasingly coherent federation of Slavic principalities under Varangian leadership. Under Prince Oleg of Novgorod, and later his descendants, Kievan Rus grew in prominence. The principality benefited from its strategic location along the Dnieper River trade route, connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea. By the early 10th century, Kiev was not only a political center, but also a cosmopolitan city, exposed to Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European influences. This period saw intensified cultural exchange and economic growth, laying the foundation for an enduring civilizational identity. It was, however, the reign of Vladimir I, often referred to as Vladimir the Great, r 980 to 1015 CE, that transformed Kievan Rus from a tribal polity into a state with a clear ideological and religious framework. In a move as strategic as it was spiritual, Vladimir converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in 988 CE and orchestrated the mass baptism of his subjects. This decision was driven not only by faith, but also by realpolitik. Aligning with the Byzantine Empire offered legitimacy, access to advanced culture and administrative practices, and a unifying belief system. The adoption of Christianity in the Byzantine Rite bound Kievan Rus to the cultural sphere of Eastern Orthodoxy, ensuring that its spiritual, architectural, and literary traditions would be modeled not on Rome or Western Europe, but on Constantinople. Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, built upon this legacy. His reign marked a golden age in Kievan Rus history. A skilled diplomat and reformer, Yaroslav codified laws through the Ruskaya Pravda, one of Eastern Europe's earliest legal codes. He established schools, patronized the arts, and fostered dynastic ties with European royalty, marrying his children into the houses of France, Norway, Poland, and Hungary. Under his guidance, Kiev became a vibrant religious and cultural capital, with its cathedrals, particularly the St. Sophia Cathedral, rivaling the grandeur of those in Constantinople. Yet the very strengths that made Kievan Rus remarkable, its vast territory, loose federation of principalities, and dependence on dynastic cohesion, would be the seeds of its fragmentation. Upon Yaroslav's death in 1054, the tradition of dividing territory among sons triggered internal rivalries and weakened central authority. Over time, Kievan Rus would devolve into competing regional powers, each ruled by different branches of the Rurikid dynasty. While the external threats had been held at bay during the height of Kievan power, the growing disunity would leave these territories vulnerable to conquest.
Mongol devastation and the rise of Muscovy. Following the death of Yaroslav the Wise, the unity of Kievan Rus gradually unraveled. The kingdom that had once stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea was no longer governed by a single ruler, but by multiple princes from different branches of the Rurikid dynasty. These princes often saw themselves not as governors under a unified crown, but as independent rulers in their own right. Succession disputes were common, often leading to wars between brothers and cousins, each claiming legitimacy over Kiev or other key cities like Novgorod, Vladimir, or Smolensk. This internal disunity weakened Kievan Rus just as new and more dangerous threats began to emerge from the east. Among the most catastrophic was the rise of the Mongol Empire. In the early 12th century, the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan's descendants, swept across the Eurasian steppe with terrifying speed and brutality. Their campaign of conquest extended from China to the heart of Europe, and the principalities of Rus found themselves in the direct path of one of history's most destructive military forces. The full scale of devastation arrived in 1237, when Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, launched the Mongol invasion of Rus. Over the next few years, major cities such as Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev were attacked, looted, and burned to the ground. Entire populations were slaughtered or enslaved. Kiev, once the shining capital of Eastern Slavic civilization, was left a smoldering ruin. The Mongol army's tactical discipline, mobility, and psychological warfare outmatched the fragmented and uncoordinated defenses of the Rus principalities. By 1240, Kievan Rus had effectively collapsed as a unified political entity.
The Mongols, now known in this context as the Golden Horde, did not seek to directly administer the Slavic lands, but instead imposed a system of tribute. The princes of the former Rus territories were forced to recognize Mongol supremacy, pay heavy taxes, and receive their titles through Mongol approval. This period of indirect domination, which would last nearly 2.5 centuries, is often referred to as the Mongol yoke. The impact of Mongol rule was profound and multifaceted. While it caused immense destruction and delayed the development of centralized institutions, it also introduced new administrative and military concepts to the Rus. The Mongols employed an efficient postal and taxation system, hierarchical bureaucracy, and organized census-taking, practices that would later be adapted by emerging Russian states. Furthermore, the constant pressure of Mongol oversight compelled Rus princes to pursue centralization and consolidation in order to survive and compete. One principality in particular began to rise amid this period of devastation: Muscovy, or the Grand Principality of Moscow. Initially an unremarkable outpost in the dense forests north of the Volga, Moscow gained prominence in the 14th century under rulers like Ivan I, Ivan Kalita. Ivan, whose name means money bag, achieved a privileged position by cooperating with the Mongols and collecting tribute on their behalf. In return, he received greater autonomy and the right to rule over neighboring lands. He also forged close ties with the Orthodox Church, whose center was relocated from Kiev to Vladimir and eventually to Moscow itself. Over the next century, Moscow steadily grew in power and influence. It became a refuge for Slavic culture and orthodoxy during the Mongol era, and positioned itself as the legitimate successor to Kievan Rus. The city's rulers pursued a careful strategy of dynastic marriages, land purchases, military campaigns, and political alliances to expand their territory. By the late 14th century, Moscow was strong enough to openly defy the Mongols. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, led by Prince Dmitry Donskoy, was a symbolic victory for the Russians against Mongol forces. Though not a decisive military defeat for the Golden Horde, it marked the beginning of a psychological shift. The Rus were no longer submissive subjects, but a people awakening to the possibility of independence. The final rupture came under Ivan III, Ivan the Great, who reigned from 1462 to 1505. Ivan III was a transformative figure who greatly expanded Muscovy's territory and power. He declared Moscow the Third Rome after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, asserting that the Russian state was now the true heir to Christian Orthodox civilization. Through his marriage to Sophia Palaiologia, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Ivan linked his dynasty to the legacy of Byzantium, further legitimizing his imperial ambitions. In 1480, Ivan III made a bold move that would end the Mongol yoke once and for all. In what became known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River, Ivan refused to pay further tribute to the Mongol Khan and faced down a Mongol army without engaging in open battle. The standoff ended with the Mongol forces retreating, symbolically marking the end of their dominance over Rus lands. Moscow had emerged as the center of a new Russian state, free from foreign rule for the first time in over 2 centuries.
Ivan the Terrible, the Tsardom, and the Time of Troubles. With the Mongol yoke finally cast off in 1480, Moscow began its transformation from a powerful principality into a centralized imperial state. Under the reign of Ivan III, Ivan the Great, and his successors, Muscovy adopted many imperial symbols and institutions, gradually evolving into something far larger than a collection of principalities. The framework was set, but it would be Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, who would fundamentally reshape the Russian state and scar it deeply in the process. Born in 1530, Ivan IV ascended to the throne as Grand Prince of Moscow at just 3 years old after the sudden death of his father, Vasily III. His early years were marked by instability, factionalism, and court intrigue. The Russian boyar nobility, the powerful aristocratic elite, dominated the regency and governed with ruthless self-interest, often neglecting the needs of the young heir. These traumatic experiences would leave a lasting impact on Ivan, breeding deep paranoia and resentment toward the nobility that would define much of his later rule. In 1547, at age 16, Ivan was crowned Tsar of all Rus, a title drawn from the Roman Caesar, signifying his role not merely as a prince among equals, but as an emperor. This coronation was a pivotal moment in Russian history. It marked the formal creation of the Tsardom of Russia, and with it, the rise of autocracy. Ivan sought to concentrate all power in his hands, elevate the monarchy above the nobility, and sanctify his rule through divine right. The Russian Orthodox Church supported this vision, reinforcing the notion of the Tsar as God's anointed ruler on earth. Ivan IV's reign began with significant reforms and achievements. Working with a council of advisors known as the Chosen Council, he reformed the military, judicial system, and central administration. The Zemsky Sobor, an early form of parliament, was established to advise the Tsar on key issues. New law codes were written to improve justice, and the military was professionalized, especially with the creation of the Streltsy, a standing army of musketeers. These reforms aimed to modernize the Russian state and increase the power of the central government. Yet this period of relative progress gave way to one of terror, violence, and instability. Following the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, in 1560, Ivan's behavior became increasingly erratic and brutal. Convinced that the boyars had poisoned her, he launched a reign of internal terror through an institution called the Oprichnina. This state-within-a-state operated outside the normal legal system and had the sole purpose of identifying, punishing, and executing those Ivan deemed traitorous. The oprichniki, dressed in black and riding black horses, terrorized the countryside, confiscating property, executing nobles, and brutally suppressing dissent. Nowhere was this repression more devastating than in the city of Novgorod. Accused of harboring treasonous intent and seeking to defect to Poland or Lithuania, the city was subjected to a horrific massacre in 1570, where thousands of citizens were tortured and killed. The scale and brutality of Ivan's purges shocked even his contemporaries and devastated parts of the country economically and demographically. At the same time, Ivan waged a series of ambitious military campaigns aimed at expanding Russian territory. His conquest of the Kazan Khanate in 1552 and the Astrakhan Khanate in 1556 extended Russian control into the Volga River basin and secured its southern frontiers. However, Ivan's later military campaigns were far less successful. His long and bloody war against the Livonian Order, known as the Livonian War, 1558 to 1583, failed to secure access to the Baltic Sea and left the country drained of resources. Meanwhile, the economy suffered from overtaxation, war, plague, and famine. The once centralized state was now burdened with instability and fear, and the population was deeply alienated from the monarchy. Ivan's personal decline reached a tragic crescendo in 1581 when, in a fit of rage, he struck and killed his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich. This act left Russia with a succession crisis. When Ivan IV died in 1584, he was succeeded by his intellectually disabled son, Fyodor I,
who lacked the ability to govern. The real power during Fyodor's reign was held by his brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who served as regent and de facto ruler. When Fyodor died in 1598 without an heir, the centuries-old Rurikid dynasty came to an end. Godunov was elected Tsar by the Zemsky Sobor, the first time a non-Rurikid sat on the throne. His rule, however, marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Russian history, the time of troubles. Between 1598 and 1613, Russia descended into chaos. The legitimacy of Godunov's rule was questioned by many nobles and rival claimants, some of whom declared themselves to be false Dimitris, pretenders claiming to be Ivan IV's supposedly murdered youngest son. One such impostor, supported by Poland, briefly seized the throne and ruled as Tsar Dmitry I, further deepening internal divisions and inviting foreign intervention. During this period, Russia suffered from widespread famine, civil war, peasant uprisings, and foreign invasion. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth occupied large portions of Western Russia, including Moscow itself for a time. The state nearly collapsed, with multiple factions, both internal and external, vying for power. It was only through a popular national uprising, led by Prince Dmitry Pozharsky and merchant Kuzma Minin, that the foreign occupiers were expelled. Finally, in 1613, a National Assembly elected Mikhail Romanov, a distant relative of the old Rurikid dynasty through his maternal ancestry, as the new Tsar. Just 16 years old at the time, Mikhail marked the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia for over 3 centuries. His election ended the time of troubles and ushered in a new era of relative stability and slow but steady recovery.
The Romanov rise, autocracy, expansion, and early westernization. With the election of Michael Romanov to the throne in 1613, Russia began its long recovery from the chaos of the time of troubles. Although young and lacking political experience, Michael's ascension was widely welcomed. His lineage offered a distant but credible connection to the old Rurik dynasty, and more importantly, he was a compromise figure among the warring factions. The boyars, merchants, Orthodox clergy, and peasantry all saw in him a path to renewed stability. Michael's early reign was characterized not by grand reforms or military campaigns, but by careful consolidation. After decades of famine, war, and occupation, his main priority was restoring the basic structures of governance. The first 2 decades were largely spent re-establishing control over the provinces, reorganizing tax systems, and rebuilding the economy. Crucially, Michael and his advisors restored the authority of the central state while also repairing relations with the Orthodox Church, which had suffered severe trauma during foreign occupation and internal strife. Despite the conservatism of his reign, Michael laid the institutional groundwork for the expansionist empire that Russia would soon become. He relied heavily on the Zemsky Sobor, but the Tsar's role was clearly dominant, marking a return to autocracy. While this period was not marked by aggressive westernization, it was a time of important rebuilding and quiet reform. Michael was succeeded by his son, Alexis I, reigned 1645 to 1676, who would preside over one of the most transformative periods in early Romanov history. Unlike his father, Alexis had a stronger vision for Russia's development. His reign saw significant internal consolidation and early stirrings of modernization, though often accompanied by social upheaval and religious strife. One of Alexis's major initiatives was legal codification. In 1649, the Ulazhenia, or Code of Laws, was issued. This comprehensive legal document reinforced the Tsar's absolute power and formalized the legal status of different social classes. Most notably, it institutionalized serfdom, binding peasants legally to the land and to their landlords. This transformed millions of free or semi-free peasants into serfs, whose labor was now the economic backbone of the empire. While this provided stability and ensured tax collection, it also entrenched deep social divisions that would plague Russia for centuries. Religion became a focal point of Alexis's reign, especially through his alliance with the influential patriarch Nikon, a reformist who sought to standardize and purify Russian Orthodox rituals in line with Greek practices. While these reforms might appear minor, adjustments to liturgical texts and ceremonial gestures, they triggered a massive schism. Traditionalists, later known as Old Believers, resisted the reforms fiercely, seeing them as heretical deviations. Alexis at first supported Nikon, but eventually turned against him due to the patriarch's overreach. The persecution of Old Believers created a long-lasting religious divide and initiated waves of repression, exile, and execution. Meanwhile, Russia began reasserting itself in international affairs. Alexis led military campaigns against Poland-Lithuania, resulting in the Treaty of Andrusovo, 1667, which returned much of Ukraine, including the vital city of Kiev, to Russian control. This was a key moment. It symbolized Russia's re-entry into European geopolitics and solidified its influence over the Orthodox Slavic populations to the west. The expanding empire now spanned from the Carpathians to the Ural Mountains and beyond. Internally, however, Alexis's reign was marred by mounting social tensions. The codification of serfdom and increased taxation provoked widespread discontent. These frustrations exploded in the Stenka-Razin Rebellion, 1670 to 1671, when a charismatic Cossack leader led a massive peasant uprising across the Volga region. Razin presented himself as a liberator of the oppressed, seeking to overthrow the boyars and challenge the Tsar's rule. Though initially successful, the rebellion was eventually crushed with brutal force. The revolt highlighted the growing gap between the centralized, autocratic state and the peasantry it relied upon. After Alexis's death in 1676, Russia entered a brief period of instability. His eldest son, Fyodor III, took the throne, but his reign was short-lived, 1676 to 1682, and marked by ill health. Despite his frailty, Fyodor attempted modest reforms, including the abolition of the outdated Mestnichestvo system, which had assigned bureaucratic rank based on noble ancestry rather than merit. This laid the foundation for a more modern bureaucracy, even if the reforms were short-lived. Fyodor's death without an heir led to a succession crisis, with competing factions supporting his half-brothers Ivan V and Peter I, who would eventually become one of Russia's most transformative leaders, Peter the Great. But even before his dramatic rise, the Romanov state had already begun to morph into something new, a vast, multi-ethnic autocracy with imperial ambitions and a growing awareness of Western Europe's military and technological superiority.
Peter the Great and the Western transformation of Russia. Few figures in Russian history tower as high as Peter I, known to the world as Peter the Great. His reign marked a fundamental rupture in Russian history, an energetic, at times violent, leap from medieval traditions toward a modern European-style state. His vision reshaped every aspect of Russian life: government, military, culture, economy, even the physical appearance of its people. Peter's ambition was clear: to make Russia not just a European country, but a European power. Peter co-ruled with his half-brother Ivan V from 1682, though Ivan played a largely ceremonial role due to physical and mental limitations.
For the first few years, real power lay in the hands of their sister and regent, Sophia Alexeyevna. But by 1689, Peter, now 17, successfully removed Sophia in a palace coup. When Ivan died in 1696, Peter became the sole ruler. From the very start, Peter was unlike any Tsar before him. Towering over his peers at over 6.5 feet tall, energetic and endlessly curious, he sought first-hand knowledge of the world outside Russia. In 1697, he embarked on the Grand Embassy, a secretive diplomatic and learning mission across Western Europe. Traveling incognito as a common nobleman, though his height made this farcical, Peter visited shipyards in the Dutch Republic, learned navigation and shipbuilding in England, observed modern European armies and governments, and studied science, anatomy, and art. The journey left an indelible impression on him. Upon returning to Russia, Peter launched one of the most radical programs of reform in European history. He was determined to drag Russia out of medieval isolation and into the modern world, whether the Russian people liked it or not. Peter centralized authority and weakened the traditional power of the boyar nobility, many of whom resisted his reforms. He replaced the outdated hierarchy of service based on lineage with a table of ranks, a system that linked promotion in the civil or military service to loyalty and merit rather than noble birth. This helped create a service nobility and a more professional bureaucracy. In military affairs, Peter built a standing army and introduced modern European training, tactics, and discipline. He also created a modern navy from scratch, something Russia had never had before. With naval bases on the Baltic and later the Black Sea, Russia began to assert its power as a maritime empire. Peter was unrelenting in his attempts to change Russian social customs. He ordered men to shave their beards, a deeply symbolic act for Orthodox Russians, introduced Western clothing, and forced nobles to adopt European court etiquette. He encouraged education in mathematics, science, navigation, and foreign languages, even establishing the first secular schools in Russia. For women, Peter's reign also brought modest reforms. Elite women were encouraged to appear at social functions, receive education, and participate in the court. Though limited in scope, these changes were radical by Russian standards and marked a shift toward a more European model of aristocratic life. Peter's modernization drive extended to the economy. He encouraged the development of domestic industry, especially in mining, metallurgy, and armaments. State-sponsored factories were established to supply the army and navy. Heavy taxation funded his military ambitions, placing immense burdens on the peasantry and reinforcing serfdom as a labor source. To secure long-term economic self-sufficiency and bolster state revenues, Peter also introduced state monopolies in key sectors like salt and tobacco. The Russian economy was still predominantly agrarian, but industrial output, especially for military production, grew under his watch. Peter's most ambitious foreign policy goal was to gain access to the Baltic Sea, a window to the west. To achieve this, he waged the Great Northern War against Sweden, at that time a dominant Baltic power under Charles XII. The war lasted more than 20 years and tested Peter's military reforms. After initial defeats, including a major loss at Narva in 1700, the Russian army improved rapidly. The turning point came in 1709 at the Battle of Poltava, where Peter decisively defeated the Swedes. This victory transformed Russia into a major player in European geopolitics and effectively ended Sweden's role as a great power. The war concluded with the Treaty of Nystad in 1721, through which Russia gained Ingria, Livonia, Estonia, and parts of Finland. These new territories gave Russia a long-desired foothold in Europe and access to international trade. Following this triumph, Peter officially proclaimed Russia an empire and himself Emperor of all Russia. While Peter respected orthodoxy as a pillar of Russian identity, he saw the Church as an institution that needed to be subordinated to the state. He abolished the Patriarchate of Moscow in 1721 and replaced it with the Holy Synod, a government body run by secular officials that governed the Church's affairs. This effectively turned the Russian Orthodox Church into a department of state, a major break from the traditional symphony between throne and altar. Despite his modernization efforts, Peter ruled as a ruthless autocrat. He did not tolerate dissent. Nobles who resisted reforms were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. Even his own family was not safe. His son and heir, Alexei, accused of treason and plotting against his father's reforms, was arrested, tortured, and likely killed on Peter's orders in 1718. The cost of Peter's vision was immense: human suffering, heavy taxation, social dislocation, but the results were undeniable. By the time of his death in 1725, Russia had emerged as one of the great powers of Europe, with a centralized state, a standing army, a modern navy, a Western-style bureaucracy, and a powerful sense of imperial destiny. Yet Peter's transformation was incomplete. Much of the population, especially the peasantry, remained outside the sphere of reform, locked in the chains of serfdom. The cultural and political divide between the elite and the masses, between reform and repression, would remain a defining feature of the Russian Empire.
Catherine the Great and the Imperial Zenith. Following the death of Peter the Great in 1725, Russia found itself at a crossroads. The state had been transformed, militarily powerful, administratively modernized, and firmly oriented toward Europe. But Peter left no clear adult successor, and in the decades following his death, the Russian throne passed through several hands, often through palace coups, backroom plots, and factional infighting. After the brief and ceremonial reign of Catherine I, Peter's wife, and subsequent short reigns by Peter II, Anna, and Ivan VI, a new and formidable ruler emerged, Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter the Great. Her reign, 1741 to 1762, stabilized the court and preserved many of her father's reforms. Though extravagant and sometimes capricious, she expanded Russia's cultural identity, notably by founding the University of Moscow and encouraging Baroque architecture and the arts. But it was her successor, Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great, who would preside over the Russian Empire's most ambitious period of cultural flourishing, imperial expansion, and centralized authority. Born in 1729 as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, Catherine arrived in Russia at the age of 14 to marry the future Tsar Peter III, Elizabeth's nephew. A keen intellect and a passionate reader of Enlightenment philosophers, Catherine quickly mastered the Russian language, converted to Orthodoxy, and began cultivating political alliances. When Peter III ascended to the throne in 1762, his reign was almost immediately controversial. He alienated the military, nobility, and clergy by pulling Russia out of the 7 Years' War and pursuing policies seen as sympathetic to Prussia. Within 6 months, Catherine, backed by the elite imperial guard, deposed her husband in a bloodless coup. Shortly afterward, Peter III died under mysterious circumstances, likely assassinated with tacit approval from Catherine's supporters. Thus began one of the longest and most impactful reigns in Russian history. As Empress Catherine II, she ruled for 34 years,
1762 to 1796, combining Enlightenment ideals with imperial ambition and creating a legacy as both a reformer and a ruthless autocrat. She styled herself as an enlightened despot, a ruler who embraced the rationalist, progressive ideas of the European Enlightenment while maintaining firm control over the autocratic state. She corresponded with leading thinkers such as Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu, and even invited them to her court. Inspired by these ideals, she sought to modernize Russian law, education, and administration. In 1767, she convened the Legislative Commission to rewrite Russia's outdated legal code. Catherine herself wrote a lengthy document called the Nakaz, or Instruction, drawing heavily from Enlightenment writers. It emphasized equality before the law, the need for a rational and efficient legal system, and the protection of property and individual rights, though carefully avoiding any suggestion of democracy or diminished czarist authority. Despite these lofty ideals, the Commission produced no new legal code, and Catherine's reforms were often limited in scope. Like many enlightened monarchs, she walked a fine line between embracing modern ideas and preserving the privileges of the aristocracy, on whom her power depended. Perhaps the greatest contradiction of Catherine's rule was her treatment of the serf population, which constituted the vast majority of Russia's people. While she spoke of liberty and rational law, Catherine's policies deepened and expanded serfdom. In exchange for noble loyalty, she granted the aristocracy greater control over their estates and serfs, even extending serfdom into new territories acquired through conquest. This widening gap between elite refinement and peasant suffering exploded in 1773 with the outbreak of the Pugachev Rebellion. Led by a former Don Cossack, Emelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be the deposed Peter III, the uprising quickly spread across the Volga region, drawing in disaffected peasants, serfs, and ethnic minorities. The rebellion called for an end to serfdom, taxes, and noble rule, effectively challenging the very foundation of the Russian autocracy. Though initially successful in capturing towns and spreading panic, the rebellion was eventually crushed by imperial forces in 1775. Pugachev was captured and executed, but the uprising deeply shook Catherine. In response, she abandoned any pretense of reforming serfdom and moved further towards centralized authoritarian control. The nobles, far from being curbed, were now more firmly entrenched than ever. Catherine's reign was also defined by aggressive expansionism, which extended Russia's borders further than at any previous time. She pursued a highly strategic foreign policy, combining diplomacy, war, and opportunism to reshape Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. In a series of wars against the Ottoman Empire, Russia gained critical territory along the Black Sea, including Crimea, following its annexation in 1783. These gains fulfilled a long-standing imperial goal, securing warm-water ports for trade and naval power, and positioning Russia as a dominant force in Southeast Europe. She also capitalized on the decline of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, orchestrating a series of 3 partitions, 1772, 1792, and 1795, alongside Austria and Prussia. By the end of the process, Poland had effectively ceased to exist as an independent state, and Russia acquired vast territories, including parts of modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. These annexations not only expanded the empire, but also brought millions of new subjects under Russian rule, many of whom were non-Orthodox, non-Russian, and often resistant to imperial authority. In the east, Catherine extended Russian control deeper into Siberia and began eyeing influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia, foreshadowing future imperial ventures. Catherine's court was a beacon of European culture. She patronized the arts, commissioned portraits, statues, operas and ballets, and established the Hermitage Museum, one of the world's premier collections of art. French became the dominant language of the Russian elite, and Western dress, manners, and philosophy permeated high society. She also promoted education, especially for women. New schools were founded, and she advocated the establishment of the Smolny Institute, the first state-financed higher education institution for girls in Russia. While education did not reach the masses, these efforts signaled a shift toward a more literate and cultured aristocracy. Catherine's engagement with science and medicine led to the founding of new research academies and a focus on vaccination and public health, including her own high-profile smallpox inoculation, meant to encourage acceptance among the skeptical population. Catherine the Great died in 1796, leaving behind a vastly expanded and transformed empire. Under her rule, Russia had become a major European power, with influence stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and from Poland to the edges of Asia. She had modernized the administration, promoted the arts and sciences, and cast Russia as a participant in the European Enlightenment. Yet her reign also deepened Russia's internal contradictions. The cultural elite flourished, while the vast peasantry remained mired in poverty and bondage. Enlightenment ideals were celebrated, yet real political freedom remained elusive. Russia had grown strong, sophisticated, and feared, but also more divided and repressive. Catherine's death marked the end of a golden age, but the empire she had shaped would continue to cast a long shadow over European and global affairs.
Autocracy, Reform and Reaction in the 19th Century. The death of Catherine the Great in 1796 brought her son, Paul I, to the throne. His rule was short and controversial, lasting only 5 years. Unlike his mother, Paul was insecure, impulsive, and erratic in his decision-making. He reversed many of Catherine's policies, sought to centralize power even more tightly, and implemented rigid military protocols modeled after Prussian standards. His policies alienated both the aristocracy and the military, particularly his attempts to control succession through a new law of primogeniture that would bind the Romanov dynasty to strict male line inheritance. Paul's erratic behavior, authoritarian excesses, and overt hostility toward the nobility made him deeply unpopular. In 1801, a group of conspirators, comprising disaffected nobles and military officers, assassinated him in his own palace. His son, Alexander I, ascended the throne in the immediate aftermath, promising a new era of reform. Alexander I began his reign with grand ideals shaped by Enlightenment thinkers and his Swiss tutor, Frederick Caesar de la Harpe. Early in his rule, he appeared open to liberal reforms. He reorganized the Senate, created several ministries, and worked to modernize the administration. There were discussions of a constitutional monarchy, and Alexander even considered granting a national representative assembly, though these plans never materialized. Despite his liberal leanings, Alexander remained a product of autocratic tradition and ultimately failed to reconcile reformist ideas with the reality of centralized power. His reign soon shifted focus due to external events, chief among them the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe. Russia's involvement in the Napoleonic Wars would define Alexander's legacy. Initially an ally of various anti-French coalitions, Alexander suffered several defeats, most notably at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. However, the tide began to turn after Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia in 2012. The Russian army, using scorched earth tactics, lured Napoleon deep into the interior. The city of Moscow was abandoned and set ablaze. Though Napoleon captured it, the harsh winter, lack of supplies, and constant harassment by Russian forces decimated the French army during their retreat.
The campaign ended in disaster for Napoleon and established Russia as a decisive force in European affairs. Alexander emerged as a hero of resistance and took part in the final defeat of Napoleon in 1814, marching Russian troops triumphantly into Paris. Following the wars, Alexander played a central role in the post-Napoleonic reordering of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. He championed the idea of a holy alliance between monarchs to preserve Christian values and suppress revolutionary movements. However, despite his newfound conservatism on the international stage, discontent brewed at home. Russian soldiers returning from Europe brought with them ideas of constitutionalism, freedom, and civic participation. Among the officer class, particularly those who had served in Western Europe, frustration mounted over the autocratic stagnation of Russian government. After Alexander's death in 1825, confusion over the line of succession led to a dramatic confrontation in St. Petersburg. Liberal-minded army officers, now known as the Decembrists, attempted to prevent the accession of Alexander's conservative brother, Nicholas I, and called instead for constitutional reform and the abolition of serfdom. The uprising was quickly suppressed, and its leaders were executed or exiled to Siberia. The Decembrist revolt marked the first open challenge to autocratic rule in modern Russian history, setting a precedent for future revolutionary movements. Nicholas I, shaken by the revolt, adopted a reactionary stance throughout his reign. He strengthened the secret police, intensified censorship, and promoted the doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality as the ideological foundation of the state. His reign was marked by strict control, surveillance, and a determination to root out any sign of dissent. While he oversaw significant expansion of the Russian Empire, particularly into the Caucasus and Central Asia, Nicholas also faced growing domestic pressures. Russia's economic and social structures remained deeply feudal, with serfdom still entrenched as the primary mode of agricultural labor. Calls for reform were silenced, but unrest simmered beneath the surface. At the same time, Russia's growing ambitions abroad led it into confrontation with the declining Ottoman Empire and the Western European powers. Nicholas I sought to position himself as the protector of Orthodox Christians in the Balkans under Ottoman control, leading to tensions with Britain and France. These tensions culminated in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, a conflict that would expose the weaknesses of the Russian state. Though Nicholas would not live to see the war's conclusion, he died in 1855. It would mark a critical turning point in Russian history.
Reform and resistance, from Alexander II to the edge of revolution. The Crimean War, which ended in 1856 with Russia's defeat at the hands of a coalition of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia, was a profound shock to the Russian Empire. It exposed the backwardness of its military, infrastructure, and administrative systems. The Russian army, still largely composed of conscripted serfs, was no match for the modern, better-equipped Western forces. The loss shattered the illusion of Russian invincibility and made clear to the new Tsar, Alexander II, that profound reforms were no longer optional, they were necessary for survival. Ascending the throne in 1855, Alexander II was determined to modernize Russia. His most consequential act was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. This monumental reform freed over 20 million peasants from legal bondage, ending centuries of serfdom and officially abolishing what many had come to view as a moral and economic anachronism. However, emancipation was implemented cautiously and often in ways that favored the nobility. The freed peasants were required to make redemption payments for the land they received, often overvalued and insufficient for subsistence. These payments would last for decades, and the land they received was controlled by peasant communes, limiting mobility and individual ownership.
Although freedom was granted in name, the social and economic chains remained. Emancipation was followed by a series of reforms aimed at bringing Russia in line with Western standards. Alexander introduced local self-government through elected rural councils, known as zemstvos, reformed the judiciary by creating independent courts and trial by jury, modernized the military with reduced service time and better training, and expanded educational opportunities, including for women and non-noble classes. These changes represented a genuine attempt to move Russia toward a more rational and efficient state model. Yet as reform progressed, so did resistance. While conservatives in the nobility and the church resented the loosening of autocratic control, many liberals and radicals saw the reforms as too limited. Among the urban intelligentsia and university students, a new generation of revolutionary thinkers emerged, inspired by socialist, anarchist, and populist ideas from Western Europe. Many believed that true justice could only come through the complete overthrow of the autocracy and redistribution of land and power to the people. One of the defining movements of the 1860s and 70s was populism. Young radicals, often from privileged backgrounds, traveled to the countryside in what became known as the Going to the People movement, hoping to enlighten the peasants and incite them to revolution. But the peasants, largely devout and conservative, were suspicious of these outsiders. Disillusioned by the failure to spark grassroots revolt, many of these activists turned to violence. Out of this growing radicalism emerged Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will, a clandestine revolutionary organization dedicated to political assassination as a tool for change. After several failed attempts, they succeeded in assassinating Alexander II in 1881, just moments after he had signed a draft for a new constitution-like reform. The Tsar was killed by a bomb in the streets of St. Petersburg, symbolizing the volatile contradiction of his reign. A ruler who sought to modernize, but whose reforms only fueled the revolution he hoped to avoid. Alexander II's assassination shocked the empire and hardened the resolve of his successor, Alexander III, who took the throne with a clear mandate: restore autocratic authority and crush dissent. He rolled back many of his father's reforms, centralized power, strengthened censorship, and expanded the secret police. Under his rule, Russification policies were intensified, forcing linguistic and cultural conformity upon the empire's many non-Russian peoples. Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, and Muslims faced discrimination, forced assimilation, and restrictions on residence and education. Economically, however, Alexander III presided over a period of rapid industrial growth. Under the guidance of Finance Minister Sergei Veit, Russia began to industrialize in earnest. Railroads, most notably the Trans-Siberian Railway, were constructed across vast distances, linking the empire's remote regions. Factories and heavy industries began to rise in cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Donbass. A new urban working class began to emerge, poorly paid, harshly treated, but increasingly conscious of its collective strength. As the 19th century drew to a close, social tensions escalated. The peasantry remained land-hungry and overtaxed, the working class faced brutal factory conditions, and the middle classes grew frustrated with the lack of political voice. Revolutionary movements multiplied. The Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, or RSDLP, was founded in 1898, splitting later into Bolshevik and Menshevik factions. Populists, anarchists, liberal reformers, and nationalist separatists all competed for influence across the empire. Nicholas II came to the throne in 1894 following the sudden death of Alexander III. Young, Shy and ill-prepared for rule, Nicholas was deeply committed to the autocratic principles of his father, but lacked the authority and decisiveness to enforce them effectively. He once famously declared, "I will never agree to a representative form of government," ignoring the growing clamor for political reform. His refusal to adapt would prove disastrous. Internationally, Russia's prestige suffered a devastating blow in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. Eager to expand influence in Manchuria and Korea, Nicholas underestimated Japan's resolve and military capacity. The war ended in a humiliating Russian defeat, with its Pacific Fleet destroyed and Port Arthur lost. For the first time in modern history, a European power had been decisively beaten by an Asian nation. The loss shattered national pride and triggered mass discontent at home. As the war dragged on, strikes, protests, and riots spread across Russia. The economic burden of the conflict, coupled with long-standing grievances, boiled over into a wave of revolutionary activity. In January 1905, peaceful demonstrators marching toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition were met with gunfire by imperial troops. The massacre, known as Bloody Sunday, horrified the public and marked the beginning of the 1905 revolution.
Revolution and collapse. The events of Bloody Sunday in January 1905 unleashed a political earthquake that shook the foundations of the Russian Empire. What had begun as a peaceful procession led by Father Georgy Gapon, intended to present a humble petition to the Tsar, ended in the deaths of hundreds of unarmed civilians. For many Russians, the massacre shattered the image of Nicholas II as the little father who cared for his people. It transformed a long-simmering sense of injustice into open rebellion. In the months that followed, strikes paralyzed major cities. Peasant uprisings swept across the countryside, and nationalist movements ignited unrest in the empire's peripheries. Even elements of the military joined the revolt, most famously in the mutiny aboard the battleship Potemkin, where sailors rebelled against their brutal officers. Though this mutiny was ultimately suppressed, it sent a clear message: the old order was no longer unshakable. Faced with widespread upheaval, Nicholas II was forced to concede. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, a document that promised civil liberties, the creation of a representative assembly called the Duma, and a commitment to constitutional monarchy. This temporarily calmed a revolt, especially among the moderate middle classes and liberal reformers who hoped the manifesto signaled a genuine transformation of Russian governance. However, the promises of 1905 quickly unraveled. While the First Duma convened in 1906, it was dissolved after only a few months when it demanded sweeping reforms. Subsequent Dumas were packed with conservatives and royal loyalists, and the Tsar, under the guidance of his reactionary prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, ensured that real legislative power remained in the hands of the monarchy. Though Stolypin implemented some agrarian reforms aimed at strengthening the class of landowning peasants, his repressive tactics, including mass arrests and executions by military tribunals, earned him the grim nickname Stolypin's necktie. He was assassinated in 1911. The years leading up to World War I were marked by a strange duality. On one hand, Russia experienced significant industrial growth and urbanization. Cities expanded, new factories rose, and the railway network grew dramatically. A vibrant, if politically constrained, civil society began to emerge, with newspapers, universities, unions, and professional associations pushing for reform. Yet the deep contradictions remained unresolved.
The autocracy clung to outdated power structures, the countryside remained volatile, the nationalities chafed under Russification, and the working class faced miserable conditions. In 1914, Russia entered World War I as part of the Allied powers, allied with France and Britain against Germany and Austria-Hungary. At first, patriotic fervor surged, and there were widespread demonstrations of loyalty to the Tsar. But the illusion of unity quickly faded as Russia suffered devastating military defeats. The ill-equipped and poorly led Russian army was no match for the modern German war machine. Casualties mounted into the millions, and morale plummeted. Nicholas II, in a fateful decision, took direct command of the army in 1915, leaving the government in the hands of his wife, Empress Alexandra, and her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin, a mystic and self-proclaimed holy man, gained influence through his supposed ability to heal the Tsarevich Alexei's hemophilia. His presence at court, his debauched reputation, and his interference in appointments and policy decisions scandalized the nobility and discredited the monarchy. The war effort collapsed into chaos. Food shortages, inflation, and transportation failures caused misery in the cities. The economy buckled under the strain, and strikes and protests became more frequent. Confidence in the regime evaporated even among the elites. In December 1916, Rasputin was assassinated by a group of nobles hoping to save the monarchy. But it was too late. By early 1917, Russia was teetering on the edge. In February, protests in Petrograd over bread shortages escalated into a full-scale uprising. Soldiers mutinied and joined the crowds. The Duma, now reasserting itself, called for the Tsar's abdication. With the capital in revolt and the military unwilling to intervene, Nicholas II abdicated on March 2, 1917, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. The collapse of the monarchy created a power vacuum. The provisional government, composed mostly of liberals and moderates from the Duma, took control. They promised elections, civil rights, and a transition to democracy. However, they made a critical decision: to continue Russia's involvement in the war. This choice proved disastrous. The army remained demoralized, the economy continued to crumble, and revolutionary fervor surged. At the same time, a parallel authority emerged, the Petrograd Soviet, representing workers and soldiers. This dual power structure made governance incoherent and fragile. Into this chaos stepped the Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist faction led by Vladimir Lenin, who had returned from exile with German assistance. Their slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," resonated deeply with a war-weary population and a peasantry desperate for land reform. By October 1917, the provisional government had lost nearly all support. In a swift and largely bloodless coup, the Bolsheviks seized control of Petrograd and declared the establishment of a new socialist regime. The October Revolution marked not only the end of the Russian Empire, but also the beginning of a new and tumultuous chapter in world history.
The end of empire, aftermath, civil war, and legacy. The October Revolution of 1917 marked the formal end of the Russian Empire. What had once been the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, collapsed not with a single battle, but through internal decay, relentless war, and the total loss of legitimacy by its rulers. In place of the Tsarist regime arose a radically different experiment, the world's first Marxist state,
led by the Bolsheviks under the uncompromising vision of Vladimir Lenin. But the seizure of power was not the end of Russia's turmoil. It was the beginning of a new and even bloodier chapter. Almost immediately, the country plunged into a brutal and multi-front civil war between the Red Army, loyal to the Bolsheviks, and the White Forces, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, Republicans, and foreign-backed anti-communists. From 1918 to 1922, Russia became a fractured battlefield where different regions were controlled by competing powers, each claiming to represent the future of the country. The Russian Civil War was marked by extreme violence, shifting allegiances, and widespread suffering. Entire cities changed hands multiple times. The Bolsheviks, despite controlling the industrial heartlands and major railways, faced existential threats from all directions. White generals like Kolchak in Siberia, Denikin in the south, Yudenich in the northwest, and nationalist movements in Ukraine, the Baltics, and the Caucasus. The Allied powers, fearing the spread of communism, intervened with troops and supplies in various theaters, but their efforts were fragmented and often half-hearted. Amid the chaos, the Bolsheviks demonstrated ruthless efficiency. Under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, the Red Army was rebuilt into a disciplined and ideologically driven force. Simultaneously, the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, carried out mass arrests, executions, and purges of counter-revolutionaries during the Red Terror. The repression was mirrored by brutality on the white side as well. Civilians suffered under both regimes, while famine and disease ravaged the countryside. One of the most tragic and symbolic acts of the Civil War was the execution of the royal family. After Nicholas II abdicated in 1917, he and his family were placed under house arrest. Initially moved to Tobolsk in Siberia and later to Yekaterinburg, they lived under increasingly harsh conditions. On the night of July 17, 1918, under orders from the local Bolsheviks, almost certainly sanctioned by Lenin himself, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and several loyal retainers were taken to a basement and shot. Their bodies were mutilated, buried in secret, and hidden for decades. The killing of the imperial family severed any hope of restoring the Romanov dynasty and served as a grim message that the old order was gone for good. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had secured control over most of the former empire's heartlands. The remnants of the White Armies fled abroad. Thousands of intellectuals and aristocrats went into exile, and the new state, formed from the ashes of the Russian Empire, was formally declared as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, in December of that year. The fall of the Russian Empire had far-reaching consequences, not only for its own people, but for the entire world. The centuries-old monarchy was replaced by a one-party dictatorship that would last until 1991. The Bolsheviks set out to dismantle the social, economic, and cultural systems of the empire, replacing the aristocracy with party elites, private land with collectivized farms, and the Orthodox Church with militant atheism. The imperial structure, once built around autocracy, orthodoxy, and loyalty to the Tsar, gave way to a society based on class struggle, state atheism, and ideological purity. In the vast non-Russian territories of the former empire, the end of Tsarist rule did not bring freedom, but a new kind of domination. Nationalist aspirations in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Central Asia, and the Baltic states were temporarily realized during the Civil War, but most were soon crushed or absorbed into the Soviet Union.
Resistance continued in various forms, but the Soviet system proved more centralized and authoritarian than the imperial government it replaced. And yet, the legacy of the Russian Empire endured. Its architecture, literature, administrative divisions, and many of its ethnic conflicts remained part of the Soviet and later post-Soviet reality. The contradictions that had defined the empire from its earliest days, modernization without liberalization, expansion without integration, grandeur built on repression, continued to haunt its successor state. The fall of the Romanovs marked the definitive end of a particular kind of autocracy, but it did not bring democracy. The revolutionary dream of a workers' utopia soon hardened into Stalinist terror. Nevertheless, the empire's rise and fall became a foundational myth in Russian national memory, a story of destiny, greatness, tragedy, and rebirth. In the end, the Russian Empire was not simply conquered from outside, it collapsed from within. Weakened by war, divided by class and nationality, hollowed out by repression and resistance, it crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. What emerged in its place would shape the next century of world history, and the echoes of its imperial past are still felt in the geopolitical tensions of today. And so, dear traveler, our journey through the rise and fall of the Russian Empire comes to a close. From forest villages and Viking sails, to glittering palaces and crowded streets, we've wandered through a land of mighty czars, brave dreamers, and a people who endured war, change, and time itself. Empires may rise like mountains and fall like shadows, but their stories remain, whispered in cathedrals, written in old letters, and carried in the hearts of those who came after. As you close your eyes tonight, remember, the world is full of stories waiting to be discovered. And each time you listen, you become part of something much bigger, a quiet, timeless journey through the past. Sleep well, curious soul. Until next time.